Hi, my name's Graham Thomas, and I'm currently the principal at North Elementary School in Lancaster, South Carolina. This was my first year as a principal here, and just to give you a little bit of my background, I did 3 years as an assistant principal at another elementary school in the district, 3 years as an assistant principal at a middle school, and then 10 years as a special education resource teacher in middle school. And that's obviously, or not obviously, but that's where my experience with co-teaching came from, was actually in doing it. So hopefully I'm going to be able to give you a little bit of insight in what that looks like. Um, I am recording this. This was something that I did live for the Academic Alliance, and people were able to ask some questions that they had towards the end of it. So I'm going to try and remember what most of those were so I can kind of also give you some more information about some things that people asked that I didn't have in the presentation. So just quickly, co-teaching is a service delivery model, not a methodology, meaning it's a way that we're delivering our special education services, not a methodology, meaning like something like project-based learning or direct instruction. Those would be methodologies. This co-teaching is not that, right? It's just a different way to get kids their services. So I wanted to make sure that I make that clear to you guys. Here are the six co-teaching models. We'll kind of go through each one and which ones are more effective, which ones are not. But these are the six co-teaching models that Marilyn Friend out of the University of North Carolina, she kind of is the guru, if you will, the founder of the co-teaching model. So here they are. The information that I'm giving you actually today about co-teaching comes out of this handbook of special education, just because I wanted to be able to back it with some research of what people have seen, not just based on my experience, because I think my experience was good in some ways and bad in others, and I want to kind of base this on some research as well. So this is where it came from if you want to look it up, or if you would like to buy the book. There's a lot of other good stuff in there, and this is just one little section of it. So in there, the biggest takeaways from it are it's mixed effectiveness, right? Co-teaching um, heavily depends on how it's implemented, just like anything in the world, right? So to me, thinking back to my time of doing it, it depended on the me and the teacher that I was paired with, if they were willing to work with me, the planning that we did together. That was the most important part of it. Students with disabilities benefit more when co-teaching includes explicit, specialized interventions based on data, right? So not just walking around helping, hey, do you need help with this, buddy? Hey, do you need help with that? It's got to be targeted, specific interventions for those kids when you go in the room. That's why the planning process is so big, and that's why the teacher that you're working with, you guys have to be working together to say, okay, once we do this, and I'm going to take this group, and I'm going to have these specific interventions based on how kids responded to some type of, formal or informal assessment, to where we can see who got it, who did it, and that's kind of how those roles are defined. And that takes me into the other one: define roles. And make sure that the responsibility is shared. So both people have to be involved with this. I've had situations where it worked really, really well, and then the ones that didn't work so well, those teachers didn't really want to do all of that. They didn't want to change what they were doing and or plan with me. And obviously, I wasn't an administrator, and didn't want to step on any toes at that time. So I just was kind of like a helper and tried to do the best I could when those kids had independent practice and time like that. So again, defining those roles is super critical, and making sure that everybody's taking responsibility. Training super important to make sure that everybody's on the same page with interventions and the best practices and research based practices. And then, like I said several times through this whole thing, scheduled, protected time for them to plan collaboratively together. Because if you're not planning together, you're not making a plan, and it's just going to end up being them teaching and somebody teaching, somebody watching, or somebody teaching and somebody kind of guiding and throwing in some support somewhere. So it has to be very intentional. Um, so which ones are the best for students with disability? So if you look at these first three here: one, teach, one, observe, not going to be very good as far as co-teaching goes. It can be good for data collection, but that's really the only thing. One teach, one assist. Again, use cautiously. There could be times where that teacher is the expert in the content and they're giving it, and you are assisting. But that would not be something you spend a lot of time in. And I guess I should have mentioned at the beginning, you could move through any of these from one point to another, right? So, like one teach and one observe. Let's say that you guys really are. Let's say it was something like behavior. You were really trying to work with the teacher, y'all are working together and say, hey, I'm going to teach today when we have whole group. If you'll just sit back and observe what this kid's doing, that can be effective in helping us to gather data. If we're doing one teach, one assist, like I said, somebody's stronger, the teacher, the general ed teacher, stronger in the content, and you're kind of assisting as they do that, that's perfectly fine. You can flow in and out of them as long as you're not staying in those first two that we're talking about. Team teaching, that can be, again, really effective if both teachers are good, and both teachers have to be good and comfortable with the content. I'll say that the team teaching wasn't my favorite in the beginning, especially in ELA. I was not as comfortable with those things, especially eighth grade ELA, general education, all my trainings in special ed. And so having to get comfortable with that, which goes back into the PD, working with the teacher, understanding what you're trying to teach, what you want them to know, and be able to do all of those things. So kind of going back to that, and then taking that and making sure that you're addressing the students' IEPs and goals. But team teaching can be good. It really just gets the group a little smaller for you. Station teaching, again, small group, allows teachers to better differentiate instruction. So maybe you do a whole group lesson, and then students have stations that they rotate through, and the teacher would be one, you would be one station where they're working with you. And again, the purpose would be to be very intentional about what you're doing. Parallel teaching can be very effective. It reduces the ratio, but again, you would want to make sure that both people are comfortable, right, with the content that they're using, because you're essentially like separating the class and teaching that way. So you've separated them. Whereas team teaching is like we're teaching together to the whole group. This parallel is like we have two separate groups. And then alternate teaching, again, can be good where one person's doing some instructional stuff, another person might be working with some students who need some more help. And this could be during like a guided practice, right, where you're working with the whole group, but I know that these several students did not get it, and I need to pull them off and do some different type of intervention with them. So again, you can flow in and out of these different types of co-teaching during one lesson. But the biggest part is just being intentional about your time. In this book that I mentioned before, here's a statement that was in there that kind of I wanted to share with you guys, and I'll just read it. And it says, this body of research also indicates that common instructional conditions in general education that tend to be problematic for students with disabilities, whole class instruction, undifferentiated curriculum, and instruction, are replicated frequently in co-taught classroom. Thus, we recommend educators retain the core tenets of special education: flexibility, intensive individualized instruction in small groups, progress monitoring, assessment, and the use of research-based practices. So essentially, if all you do is add another human to the room and you don't do anything differently, we do a whole group lesson and you just go around and kind of help, maybe even help some of the people, and you don't have any differentiated instruction or differentiated interventions that you're using with the kids, then it's not going to be very effective at all. So I just want to make sure that everybody understands that. There's just not a lot of research in general to say that it's better than pulling kids out for resource. That's why you have to be really careful, because you can't say, oh, well, this is really good because we're keeping the kids in the classroom. I fully agree with that, keeping them there. But when we're doing that, remember the goal of special education is to deliver specially designed instruction. So if there's nothing different about the instruction that's going on, even in that general education classroom, then it doesn't count as special ed. Or I shouldn't say doesn't count, but is That's not what it's supposed to be designed for. So just remember that when we're moving forward. Um, okay, so when we're talking about interventions and intensifying, there's a couple of ways that you can do that. And I took this from the taxonomy of intervention intensity. And in this presentation, there's a link there, but it highlights how to assess and strengthen interventions across the seven dimensions. And those are strength, dosage, alignment, attention to transfer slash generalization, comprehensiveness, behavior support, individualization. It emphasizes uh, that effective interventions, um, they can't just be or exist like it says here. They must be intensive enough to meet the student needs. Um, that's saying a lot. That's a lot of words in there that may mean something to you or not. But if we're talking about one of those words like dosage, right? Like that's how often that is happening. So I know a lot in elementary schools when we give our general ed teachers an intervention, we say, do this for 15 minutes 3 times a week. Well, to up it, you might up the amount of time those 3 times a week, 30 minutes, 20 minutes, whatever, or 5 times a week for 15 to 20 minutes, those kind of things. So if you look at this, what does that mean in co-teaching? Targeted intervention should be woven into classroom instruction, right? So again, it should be a dedicated time for those things for those kids. Co-teachers must adjust intensity based on student response, right? So we have to be basing these decisions on data. And that data is how is the student responding. And if you think about what we talk about in PLC meetings all the time, if you're a school that does PLCs, and I feel like everybody does now, or they should be, you're asking yourself, what do we do with the ones that got it, and what do we do with the ones that don't? So the ones that don't usually are kids in special education. How do we respond? How are we upping the intensity of the intervention that we're using, right? And what does that look like each day? And you have to plan for those things. And then collaboration ensures supports are individualized but still connected to core content. So I think that's the hardest part, is making sure. I think that teachers sometimes worry that we're not accessing the general curriculum enough, that I don't want to, for lack of a better word, we're dumbing it down, or we're taking it back to how whatever these particular 2 grade levels below, or whatever it is. So just make sure that however you're differentiating the instruction, and I'll give my middle school, high school people an example. um, like I was working with my son, and he was working on equations, and these were multi-step equations, not just 2-step. And one way that they make it more complicated is to give them decimals and fractions in there, to make the numbers more complicated. And an easy way to differentiate that is to give very simple basic numbers that work out evenly, that aren't fractions or decimals. And that really, that that's I'm oversimplifying that, I think, but that's kind of what I'm talking about. That they're still getting the skill out of it, but maybe not at the rigor that And I don't necessarily like the rigor word, because everybody has a different level of what that means, but they're not exactly at the rigor of what the standard's calling for. So that's what you're looking at, is to get, did they get the skill, and then start to work back up to that. So again, that's how you intensify and differentiate in those ways. I put in here a sample of what my schedule looked like. I pulled this up from the last year that I taught, and what it would look like. And one of the things that we did was, we saw that we had kids who did not have an intellectual disability, or what we considered to go into a self-contained class. So you shouldn't be putting kids who are LD into a self-contained class, right? But we still saw that there was a gap there, of they weren't able to make it in the co-taught, um, even with all the modifications, accommodations that we were trying to give them. They were still having a very difficult time keeping up. So we created what we called these intensive classes, and I would teach that. So I would get kids who were struggling real bad. Okay, I don't know another way to say it, but real bad. I would take those kids, and I would be their teacher of record. They'd come to me for a period, and it was super normal, and it didn't make them stick out as much. And that was our principal at the time's kind of philosophy, is that kids change class in middle school, and they just came to me. I was their math teacher, or I was their language arts teacher. And what I would do is I would take that And I know that we're already trying to strip down the standards and we're trying to get to the essential standards and do that. But my goal was really to try to get them the most basic skills up to par to where they could go back into that co-taught class and access, the curriculum at that point. And that was, that could be difficult. And I did have kids that would be able to come out of that. So um, I think we need to remember that these things are flexible, right? I had several kids that would rotate in and out, right? So um, keep it flexible. But we had an enrichment period in there, and that's also when I would pull kids. No, my mom doesn't want to hear this, but on like Mondays and Fridays was like hey, we got to help with some time to catch up on assignments. I think it was Mondays and not Mondays and Fridays, but it was that kind of thing, organizational days, those things to help them get caught up. And then the other days actually did a reading program, Linda Mood Bell, a couple of the years. I used, this was a time where I'd pull kids in and I'd group them and I could do SRA reading mastery because I think it was more than a 30-minute thing. It was like 40 minutes at one point, 50 minutes, but it was kind of an enrichment time. And that's when I also had time to pull my students. So, and if you look at how the rest of the schedule is laid out, I would rotate between two teachers every other day. So like I would go teacher A Monday and Wednesday, teacher B Tuesday and Thursday, and then every other Friday. Now that did make it hard to make sure that with the consistency of being in there every day, but that's why our planning had to be tight. And again, same thing. I'd go into two different math classes on the same kind of thing. But that planning, one of the times, and we had to make sure that we did this too. Math PLC time would have to be first. I put planning and PD. They could flip flop either of those because at the time, and the reason that I left this, part of it was supposed to be time that the school or our coaches or a principal could meet with you, grade level administrator, assistant principal could meet with you. And then the other time was supposed to be like your protected planning time. So they scheduled there so that ELA, like the last year I did it, ELA went first. So I planned with them. And then after that, I planned with math. Now, I know what you're thinking, special ed teachers. You're like, well, when do I get time for planning? Yeah, yeah, you might miss out on that. And we were able to figure out one team would do Tuesdays, one team would do Fridays sometimes, so that I didn't miss out on that stuff. But that's the way that it had to happen, and that's the way that it was the most effective. And I had to write IEPs in the morning. I like to get to school early, or Monday nights was my night to write IEPs. I'm not sure why, but that's just the night that I decided I would do it, make Mondays bad all around. But again, having that time where you're in there with them, making sure that you're intentional about those lessons that you're doing every single day. But that's an example. I'm in an elementary school now, and I'll tell you that I'm having a more difficult time with this being my first year as a principal, coming up with what that looks like, because they're so used to taking the kids out of the classroom, when you could go in. Now, part of that would be grouping the students, which we actually just looked at, and then making sure that you have the same planning time as the teacher, so that you could plan that effectively and not just have it be a time that you go in. So again, it all goes back to the planning and what you're doing and being intentional about that. All right, some final thoughts here. Common protected planning time. I don't know how many times I have to say it. And I think a question came up in the session when I was doing it, and they said, well, how do you make sure that it happens? Well, you got to work with your principal. The first thing I did before starting to make the new master schedule for next year was I went to my two resource teachers here and I said, hey, let's look at your groups, let's look at your kids, let's look at what we want to do, and then how we're going to make that all work into our master schedule, because that's the first thing that you got to do. Even gave them the opportunity to, come up with some thoughts and suggestions on what would be a good master schedule for them. And then you can work out from there, because that's required. I know that there are some other requirements that like different districts have in our state, they have on us. But that special education time is the biggest one that you got to make sure you're meeting for those kids. So getting that scheduled first and then working out from there is really big. So talk with your administration. I'm sure they would love thoughts and feedback on that, or at least I do. Again, clear expectations. So if I was going to do this, then it would have to be very well, the procedures would have to be really clear. You got the teams have to plan together. There have to be targeted interventions. They have to base it on data. When we meet for PLCs, that's what we would be talking about. Okay, well, what did you see? Okay, what are we gonna do in this next time when we're teaching this next thing? Knowing we have to follow the curriculum guide, the scope and sequence. We have some flexibility, but knowing that we're where we're trying to go in that process. Um, like I just said, explicit specialized interventions based on progress monitoring data and flexible grouping. Flexible grouping is something that I haven't talked about a lot so far, but it's one of the things that we were able to do here this year with I'm sure some of you heard of a walk to read type of model. So our second grade team actually was the first one to kind of jump on when I made the suggestion back in the fall. And they, for their U-Fly, which is a phonics program, I'm sure some of you know what that is as well. It's a phonics program, and they have like a 30 to 45-minute block for that phonics program, and all of them are supposed to be doing U-Fly. And again, my school currently, about 50% of the kids are below grade level. So they're teaching in their classrooms, and half of them are not on pace of where they're supposed to be. So they said, when I brought that up, what if we did just for that time? The kids go to the classroom. You guys group them, and they use there's an assessment piece in UFly where you can see where the kids are. So that's what they use. It's a spelling inventory that they use for that, and then they group them. And then they started on the lesson that they were instructionally on, and then started working forward from there. Saw a lot of good progress from there. And I thought that was really good. And that ended up going to first grade and kindergarten. They both did that as well, of instructionally grouping their kids. A question was asked, where do you get the time to do that? Well, we gave them time. We had flex planning days. And so you can tell your administrators this. Now, I'll say that our teams are smaller, 4 or 5 teachers. It's going to be 5 next year. But on every couple of weeks, so let's say 2 to 3 weeks, we would give them an extra hour. So instead of doing those, we're getting everybody subs for a whole day because nobody's as productive as they want to be when you get a whole day. But we would give them an extra hour. So they would take their kids to their related arts or specials time. And then we would have 4 or 5 people within the building, me being one of them. I had to do it quite a few times. But we would pick them up, and it just so happened that they'd either be going to like lunch or recess or something like that after, or they could be going back in the classroom. Several times I took them back in the classroom, and they would get them working on something, or I would get them working on something until their teacher came back. But doing it more often, but in a shorter amount of time, was much more feasible to me because we could cover it in house. And then I feel like you get a little more work out of it because it's not like an all day of, we've got all day to plan all these things. This is a specific time. So that was one of the things that came up about how we do that. I'm trying to think of some of the other questions that people had. I think the biggest one was like, how do you find that common planning time? And it really goes back to asking your principal, your administration, hey, I want to be a part of the planning process when we're moving forward. So let me be a part of that so we can help and we can find that common planning time. I'm thinking, I think that was the biggest part, especially about the flex planning time. I'll tell you that our kindergarten assistants were good with it every once in a while because we'd take one of those as like a rotation. Take one of the kindergarten assistants. We had a couple other assistants in the building, an interventionist or whatever, and they would take like a role. I would take it sometimes. My assistant principals, we'd go in there and get them. And again, it would be an hour. And then, but I'll say I know I make it sound easy, but you have to do that for sixth grade levels because everybody needs the time K through five. But that definitely is something. Um, but the big, again, finally, the final thought on all of this is that make sure that you have that common time to plan together. Make sure that you're doing some real interventions based on data and progress monitor what you're doing, and that you're have a specific process that you're going to follow. So if the administration in your building, or if you are the administrator, you need to make sure that those roles are defined clearly, that you are there for the planning sessions. That's one of my goals this year, is to be more involved in that planning, because that's where it starts, and then going to see, are we carrying that out in the classroom? Um, so those are the things that kind of happen. Um, if you have any other questions, and you'd like to get in contact with me, again, it's Graham Thomas, North Elementary School. You can find my email on our website. So thank you guys. I really appreciate it.